Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome you on behalf of the North Africa and Middle East Department of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces, but also some new faces. And of course, I don't claim to know each one of you. I think about 400 or something who are here in the hall and sitting on the balcony. But I'm especially happy that you managed to come here through the rain on bicycles or cars through the traffic, and that you made an effort to be here. And of course, we will reward you for that, because we have some excellent speakers tonight. Some of you were here in September, on the 25th of September. We also paid attention to ISIS with the Henriette van Lynden lecture. The title then was Jihad on Our Doorstep. We focused on the attraction of ISIS to some people. Also, we focused on the situation on the ground, actually, in Syria and in Iraq. But now it's a little bit different. We focus on the geopolitical developments. So the title, ISIS Tilting the Chessboard, the Dawn of a New Middle East Balance of Power. Actually, there should be a question mark behind that, because that's open for discussion. So we will tonight talk about the major players in the region, the major powers, the countries, what their motives are, how do they affect the balance of power, how does ISIS affect it, and what we foresee will happen in the future. Now, since the declaration in June this year of the Caliphate of the Islamic State by ISIS, and I continue to call it ISIS, I think American friends and others call it ISIL, but I continue to call it ISIS and not IS. A lot has been said about redrawing borders. It has been said this is the end of Sykes-Picot. The whole map of the Middle East will be redrawn. Well, we will see whether that will happen. We see that countries, different countries in the region and outside of the region, try to influence what's happening on the battlefield, using proxies sometimes or other ways of influencing the outcome of this conflict in the Middle East. Articles have been written comparing the situation to a new Cold War. Basically putting Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other side. A view that was put in an article, and you hear it also more and more. I'm very interested in what our experts, our speakers will say about that, whether that's too simplistic or whether they agree with it. So a number of questions tonight, and I hope we will all get answers to that. Who will benefit from the current situation? And also important, I think, for us as an audience sitting here in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, what can the West do, or what should the West not do? Now I will introduce the first speaker, and later I will introduce the other speakers. First speaker, we're very happy that she's here, is Mina al-Oraibi. She was born in Iraq. She is originally from the city of Mosul, but currently residing in the UK. Mina is an assistant editor-in-chief of Asharq Al-Awsat newspaper, quality newspaper, that has extremely good sources in, maybe also resources, definitely sources in the region, journalists covering the situation on a day-to-day, I would say minute-by-minute basis. So they're well informed and highly respected. Of course, you don't always have to agree with them. Now, she was previously a bureau chief in Washington. She has done a number of high-profile interviews, among which with the former Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. She has a BA, a bachelor's and a master's degree in history from the University College in London. She writes for many different publications. She has appeared in many different publications. And actually, I understood that Foreign Policy magazine has named her one of the top 100 Twitterati in foreign politics. 2 consecutive years. Now, talking about Twitter, you can tweet tonight. The hashtag for tonight is hashtag HVL, so that's for Henriette van Lynden, HVL Middle East. So not the same as last time, for those of you who were here. hashtag HVL Middle East. You can also ask questions through Twitter, and I will not promise you that you will have an opportunity to get an answer, but we'll do our best, of course. Now, coming back to Mina al-Oraibi, she is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, so that's a very small select group. And she will give a broad overview of trends and talk about geopolitics in the Middle East and the effects of the rise of ISIS on the balance of power. Now, as I normally do, I always say whatever will be said tonight by our three speakers does not necessarily reflect the views, opinions of the Dutch Foreign Ministry, neither does it not reflect our views, but of course I will not tell you when it is in line with our views and when not. Please switch off the ringtones of your phones. Don't switch off your phones because you have to tweet, of course. But please switch off the ring phones. And I would now, with a warm round of applause, like to invite Mina al-Oraibi to come and take the floor.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for making it out on a Friday night to hear about ISIS and this very troubled region. I'd also like to thank Ernesto and the Dutch Foreign Ministry for a really invigorating 2 days of discussions. Sadly, quite often on a sad note, we haven't been able to come up with too many solutions, but we have at least thought about some possible steps to take to try to turn this downward spiral that is happening in our region. Being a journalist, I'm going to start by taking apart the title of tonight's session. It says, ISIS tilting the chessboard, the dawn of a new Middle East balance of power. ISIS is not the only one tilting the chessboard. The chessboard maybe has already been tipped over with all the events of not only the last 3 or 4 years of revolutions, revolts, war, but also it has really been turned around from 2003 and the war in Iraq and everything that came after. So I think ISIS is really a phenomena of what we've seen happening in the region. The second part of the title, the dawn of a new Middle East balance of power, I think part of what we're seeing in the region now is that there is no real balance of power. The balance is changing at a speed that many of us are trying to read, and us not only as journalists and people who are following the events, but who are actually in the eye of the storm, finding it quite difficult to take positions where they're not only reacting to the speed of light that we're seeing happening. So I think it's important not to be blindsided by ISIS and by the threat, especially for countries like in Europe or in the US, where we go to a time that everything in the region is seen through a counter-terrorism perspective. Because in the end, that will be detrimental not only to the region, but I believe also to the policies of these countries. And so it's important to take note of ISIS to understand the phenomena that's behind them, and that's what I'll try to outline in the next 9 minutes or so. So forgive me for everything I'm going to have to omit in the next 9 minutes. I believe one of the main reasons that we see ISIS taking root in Iraq and Syria, or parts of Iraq and Syria, is that there is a failure of politics in the region. There has been a failure of politics to bring in people to solve their problems. And this failure of politics in Iraq has been from a political system that is completely dysfunctional. You have members of government that speak as though they are an opposition party rather than responsible for what is happening within their own country. You have parts of Iraq that were left to a great part without any law enforcement. So if we look at Mosul, where ISIS swept in on the 10th of June 2014, there was a lack of law enforcement for 4 to 5 years, 4, 5 years or so, where the police really played no role. Kidnappings were normal. Ransom payments were demanded and were made. And the state had no role to play in all of this. This established a system of organized crime that now has been used by ISIS, and some of them have joined the ranks of ISIS officially, and others are part of this network that's allowing the group to flourish. In Syria, of course, we've had a complete failure of politics, not only to stop the spiraling of the civil war, but also the international community system of government failing, where time and again the UN was unable to really take on a role of a system of international governance. And we found that domestically politics was failing and internationally politics was failing. So that, I think, is an important phenomenon. The second failure has been the failure of governments providing the very basic service that all of us expect from our governments, and that is the provision of security. And that's linked very much to the phenomena of the rise of militias and the rise of groups where arms are no longer the monopoly of the state. And this is, of course, not only in Iraq and Syria, but in different parts of the Arab world, Lebanon namely, and others. And this trend means that we can start seeing security vacuums happen in other parts, and you might start seeing other groups that come under the affiliation of ISIS because ISIS appears in the propaganda war to be winning, whatever winning means. If winning means that you can at least survive the strikes of 30 countries in a coalition out to destroy you, then in that sense they're winning. They're not truly winning in the sense of actually being able to establish a state as such that is recognized and can actually rule its people without the sheer brutality of beheadings and other horrific acts that we've seen. Now, this failure of state governance and the failure of actually providing security is something that really leads to the fears of failed states. And we're seeing 4 Arab countries at the moment, in one form or the other, of civil war. So Iraq and Syria I've spoken about, but Libya and Yemen are 2 other countries that at the moment face the real threat of radicalization that no one knows yet what will happen. And those are the ones where it's clear. The ones less clear, for example, are Egypt. We actually have a group that's now pledging allegiance to ISIS. And the failure of politics there, but also the security-only approach, will not allow people to find a way to come to a conclusion of serious grievances that they have. So these rising fears of ISIS growing in the region means that there needs to be an approach where we can not only safeguard the countries, but the borders of these countries. Because the idea of ISIS being able to go beyond the borders is not because these countries are based on artificial borders. All countries had their borders set at one time or another, unless you're an island, where geography enforces it upon you. There have been historical reasons for all these countries. But the failure of establishing borders in the region is not only because of ISIS, and it's because of many issues, but one issue that I want to raise that often is never mentioned when we talk about the problems of the region in the last few months. And that is the issue of Palestine. When Israel refuses to define its borders as a state, there is a problem. We need to know the borders of the states of the region. And if we don't have borders for a region, it can start to encourage others and say, hey, maybe borders aren't that important. Maybe I can force my way into creating a de facto state. Of course, in no way am I saying that ISIS and Israel are in any way the same, or even relevant comparison as countries, because ISIS is not a state, and Israel is a very different entity. But the importance of the rule of law and what that means for the region. You need a generation to grow up that believes in borders, that believes that their state actually counts, and that it is going to be protected by a government, and is going to be respected and appreciated on the international stage. And I think this is a phenomenon that we have to deal with. Now, my final point, before Ernesto throws me off the stage, is to speak about the importance of regional powers and the balance of power. We can't only look at the countries of the region. because of course, countries outside of the region sometimes play an even more instrumental role. And here, of course, I refer to the United States, and we see increasingly Russia and the important role that it can play. The US is a regional power, and it's come back to the Middle East now. Some would say that the presence of the US has come back to the Middle East kicking and screaming, but they are there now, and they have taken on a military position, and it can't be just military. Now, we hear many statements from officials saying this can't be just a military solution, but all too often it's just a statement. We actually need to see the follow-up. And so, to avoid ISIS spreading further, or to actually start working at defeating ISIS, there's going to have to be a real effort from the US and from the international community to engage beyond the military strikes. And that is yet to be seen if it will happen beyond conferences and photo opportunities that last for half a day with different ministers whizzing in and whizzing out. And that, I think, is something that quite a few European officials have taken on board and working towards. But quite often we see that in the US, it's linked to what happens next with Iran. And even though the nuclear negotiations are completely unrelated to ISIS, they are important in knowing how the relationship between the US and Iran will unfold, and the consequence of that for the US's relationship with other Arab countries, namely Saudi Arabia. And that's what our two next panelists will discuss, so I won't step on their territories. But I would leave you with just one thought. The issue of the refugees in the region. There are now approximately 13 million refugees and internally displaced peoples in the region. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, but it's also a very important security issue. The changing demographics and the idle young men, mainly, but also women, might feel that they have no other economic opportunity or opportunity to create their own destinies than to join the ranks of militant forces. And most probably, ISIS would be the most appealing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mina al-Oraibi, for enlightening us on your views regarding balance of power, and also particularly in the last part for bringing in that element of youth, the younger generation, and the dynamics that come from that. Now we go to our second speaker. And the second speaker is Professor Bernard Haykel. He is a professor at Princeton University in the United States. He holds a PhD in Oriental Studies from Oxford University, and he is an expert on many issues regarding the Middle East, but he is particularly specialized in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. He is not only an expert on those countries, but he's also an expert on Islamic movements, with a particular focus on Salafi movements and on the roots of the ISIS ideology. So he has actually a book that's coming out in January, I believe. So you can already put in your reservations, and maybe he will come back to sign his book next time, which is an interesting book, I think, at least to judge by the title, Saudi Arabia in Transition. So he's written that book together with two other experts, Stéphane Lacroix and Thomas Heckhammer, for those of you who are familiar with the topic. It will be published by Cambridge University Press. He has published many other books. I think one other book came out a few years back, Global Salafism. I think that is the book you have to read if you want to know more about Salafism. And Bernard wrote part of it, and the editor was also Roel Meijer from the Netherlands. Now, Bernard will talk about the ideological roots a little bit, I think, of ISIS, and particularly about the regional agenda of Saudi Arabia within the context of the search of ISIS. Now, I would like to welcome Professor Haykel to take the floor.
I would, of course, like to thank Ernesto Braam and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be in the Netherlands. I have to tell you that Princeton University, the Princeton where I am based, has orange for its color, and which is why I'm wearing the tie. And the building, the central administrative building, is called Nassau Hall, and the central street in the town is called Nassau Street. So we have a very strong and intimate connection to Dutch history. So let me now, without further ado, talk to you a bit about ISIS. Its ideology. So I think I want to divide my talk into three parts. One is ISIS's ideology, how Saudi Arabia sees ISIS, and finally, what can be done about ISIS. And I'll touch on my own country, the United States, and what I think it is doing now, and how I think what it is doing is wrong, just by way of preempting what I'm going to say. So ISIS's ideology is derived from something called Salafism. Salafism is a minority tendency in Islamic history that has always approached texts of revelation, the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, in a literal fashion. They claim to want to return to a pristine past, the first 3 generations of Muslims. They're very self-consciously trying to do this. When the caliph, this new caliph Ibrahim in Mosul, gave his sermon on the 1st of Ramadan, he self-consciously dressed and spoke like the first caliph, or like what he thinks the first caliph was like. And so there's a very strong and intimate attention to texts and to the original texts of Islam, and trying to say that everything they do is based and draws its authority from these texts. So to say that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam is actually factually wrong. Of course, ISIS has a particular interpretation of Islam, which is at odds with the interpretation of many, if not most, Muslims about how Islam should be understood and practiced. And you can see this from obvious things, like they practice slavery. Most Muslims don't practice slavery. They crucify people. Most Muslims don't crucify people, and so on. And the list goes on and on. Now, it is tied, ISIS's ideology is tied to the ideology that is dominant in Saudi Arabia, which is often referred to as Wahhabism, or which is the name of the founder of the movement in the 18th century. It's not a label that the Wahhabis themselves use for themselves, but there's an intimate connection there in that the Wahhabis are also Salafis, although there are very important distinctions between the Wahhabis and between ISIS. One of the most important distinctions between them is that the Wahhabis have never and do not and are not interested in creating a caliphate. So what is a caliphate? A caliphate is a unitary Muslim state ruled by a caliph that recognizes no territorial boundaries and that seeks to expand under the leadership of the caliph, who is the successor. That's what caliph means, and he's a successor to the Prophet, or so the title implies. And the Saudis are not interested, have never been interested, nor have the Wahhabis been interested in caliphate for a number of reasons. But one of the most important of which is that the Saudi royal family do not have the qualifications by law to hold the title of caliph. One of the qualifications of the caliphate is to be a descendant of the tribe of the Prophet, a group called the Quraysh. The caliph of ISIS claims that he is a descendant of that tribe, whereas the Saudi royals are not members of that tribe. So they're by default excluded from ever becoming caliphs. Now, the other thing about ISIS that you should know, and just a little aside, is that it is a sect or a cult that split off from Al-Qaeda. It's a much more violent sect of Al-Qaeda's, and it shares the same narrative of Al-Qaeda. This narrative is basically that Muslims are living and have been living for centuries now under a regime of humiliation. The humiliation is because of the enemies of Islam. The enemies of Islam are multiple. They include the West, whom they call crusaders. They include Jews, and they include Shiites, whom they also have really nasty terms and labels for. So there are enemies within Islam, and there are enemies outside of Islam who are out to humiliate and weaken and enfeeble Muslims. More importantly, it's not just these enemies who are humiliating Muslims, but there are rulers in the Muslim world who act as puppets of the West, who are apostates, who are actually people who have abandoned the faith of Islam and who are working at the behest of these enemies, these external enemies. And these apostates have been identified. So the rulers of Saudi Arabia are considered apostates by both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Why? Because they do the West's bidding, and more specifically, in legal terms, they don't apply Islamic law. This is one of the conditions of a legitimate Muslim state, and they're not legitimate because they don't apply Islamic law, which in Arabic, for those of you who know Arabic, they say that they don't do tahkim shar' Allah. Now, what are Muslims to do because of this state of humiliation and enfeeblement? The answer that Al-Qaeda presents, but in a more accentuated fashion ISIS presents, is one, the sanctification of violence. That the only way for Muslims to respond to this condition of humiliation and weakness is to resort to violence, which they call jihad. And moreover, this violence has to take both organized form, but also privatized form. And what do I mean by the privatization of violence? They call upon every Muslim in the world to take upon him or herself the duty, they consider it a duty, to take up arms and to kill any American, any Jew, any enemy of the Muslims, including Shiites and Sufis and Muslims who would consider themselves Muslims but don't agree with Al-Qaeda or ISIS's version of Islam. So most of the targets of Al-Qaeda, if you count by numbers, and as well as most of the targets of ISIS, if you count again by numbers of those who have been killed, are other Muslims. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. They have gone about systematically hereticizing or anathematizing, that is to declare other Muslims to be non-Muslims, especially Sufis and Shi'is. And here they also differ with the Wahhabis in that their kind of violence and the way in which they approach other Muslims has an untamed quality to it, an uncontrolled, undisciplined quality to it, which the Saudi Wahhabis don't share. Now, the Saudi royal family is a target of attack of this movement. So they clearly would like to see this movement destroyed. However, they are in a bind. The Saudi royal family are in a bind, inasmuch as a number of ordinary Saudi people have a very ambivalent attitude when it comes to ISIS. Some might even support it. And by supporting ISIS, I don't mean that they necessarily agree with the ideology of ISIS, but that ISIS represents something that is deeply satisfying. So what is this satisfaction? The satisfaction is that ISIS is fighting the good fight against the enemies. It's fighting Shiites when many Sunni Arabs, including many Saudis, see Shiites under the influence of Iran becoming very dominant across a huge region of the Middle East where Sunnis have for over 1,000 years ruled, by which I mean Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinian territories. So I'll give you an anecdote, a couple of anecdotes to make this a bit more tangible. Do I still have a couple of minutes?
We have about two
minutes. Okay. Yeah. A couple of anecdotes. So this summer I was in Saudi Arabia at the Islamic University in Medina, and the rector of the university told me, you know, we don't engage with debates about ISIS on Twitter or on Facebook and so on because it's too controversial. I said, what do you mean it's too controversial, I asked. He said, well, you know, a lot of people here on campus actually support this movement. Even though the king of Saudi Arabia had explicitly told the clerics and all the religious scholars that they had to be much more vociferous, much more active in condemning ISIS. So there is this situation that the Saudi royals find themselves in, which is they're not sure of how many of their own people are in support of this movement. And ISIS, the way I see it, at least, is not just, when we think about it, I don't think we can think about it simply as a terrorist organization or even as a cult. I think it is a symptom, it is a manifestation of a much deeper malaise, a much deeper sense of grievance that is felt by many Sunni Muslims throughout the Arab world in particular, but also beyond. This is a grievance that is rooted in what Ms. al-Oraibi just mentioned. There's a sense of misrule, people have not been governed properly, injustice, bad regimes, corrupt regimes, not enough employment. There are lots of grievances that people feel with respect to how they're ruled, but also with respect to where Muslims are in the larger community of nations, as disempowered and increasingly marginal. And that somehow ISIS gives vent to this sense of disenfranchisement. So there is a deeper structural problem, which is that of disempowerment and misgovernance. And therefore, ISIS, I think, gives voice to that, an extreme voice to that sense, although many people don't necessarily share that ideology, but might support it for some sort of cathartic or vicarious thrill that you get out of watching them. So let me just end on the prescription. Just following on from what I just said, fighting ISIS will not solve the problem, because as I said, it's a manifestation of something deeper. And moreover, if you do what the United States is doing now, which is to start bombing them from the air, you're actually confirming ISIS's narrative that namely Christians, Westerners, Jews, Shiites are out to destroy the true believers, the true Muslims. All indications are that the recruits are up since America started, and along with Holland and others, have started bombing ISIS. And I finally would like to add that I don't really see ISIS as a threat to the world, certainly not to the Western world. They're a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization. Where ISIS is a real threat is it's a threat to the Middle East itself, to the people of the Middle East, to the moderate Muslims, to the people who are not very religious, to the Sufis, to the Shiites, and to many other people of goodwill, especially in the region. But its terror is nothing new, and it is something we will have to live with, whether ISIS is around or not. And in as much as the US has started bombing ISIS, it has done us all a great disservice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bernard, not only for the substance, of course, of your presentation, but also for keeping more or less within the time limits, which is very difficult because he's a very good lecturer as a professor at Princeton, and I think we could listen to him with a lot of attention for a long time, but then you have to come back, I think, or do it via video conference. So now we go to the third speaker from a completely different angle. We have now Ali Vaez. He's a senior analyst on Iran with the International Crisis Group. He's based in Turkey, in Istanbul, and he has a particular focus on Iran's nuclear program and on geopolitics. He's an interesting person because many of our speakers, usually previous occasions, are political scientists or historians or Islam experts. But he was actually trained as a scientist, and being Iranian, I think, well, even trained maybe as a nuclear scientist, if I'm correct. So don't tell anyone else, you know, you might get into trouble for that. But still, he did get a visa to come to the Netherlands. He has a PhD from the University of Geneva. He also holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. Well, who can beat that? He has more than 10 years experience in journalism and has written widely on Iranian affairs. Ali is regularly appearing on BBC television, on CNN, NPR, Reuters, and the list goes on and on and on, of course. So we're very happy that he's here tonight and not on CNN and BBC. So that's their loss and we win. Now Ali will discuss tonight the interest and the strategy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Middle East. And he will particularly focus also, I hope, on the relationship between Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. That very sometimes tense relationship. But I think there might be some signs, but Ali can, I think, give us more up-to-date information that maybe these two countries find each other in a common fight against ISIS. Now, without any further ado, Ali, I would like to invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. I think you've put my life at threat now, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting me. I've been given the task of talking about a difficult subject, one that you don't often hear, which is the view from Tehran. I have to go back to Ernesto's caveats that I don't represent the official view. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think it's important to have a good understanding of it because it's really is an essential part of finding a solution if there is to be any inclusive solution to the problems in the region. Now, in describing the sources of Iranian conduct, I had actually a difficult time coming up with something that would allow me to put this in a structure. Then I found this quote by Greek philosopher, weird thing, a Persian using a Greek philosopher, Thucydides, who basically says that the states are motivated in whatever they do by three main elements: fear, honor, and interest. And I think this actually helps in describing the sources of Iranian conduct and how Iran is dealing with the new phenomenon of ISIS, or as we in the region call it, Daesh. Now, let me start with fear. Now, when the Iranians look at Daesh, what they see is basically the latest, the newest phase of a continuum that started in the early days of the Islamic Revolution. It was designed to undermine and contain the Islamic Republic and the revolution. It has had different manifestations. It has turned out as Saddam Hussein. It has the same root and the same cause and the same elements as Taliban. And now basically Daesh is just the newest kid on the block. They really see it in that view. And you know, it's not a secret. You can go on the Supreme Leader's Twitter account and you can see some of the graphics that he regularly posts. And one of them that caught my attention shows Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Daesh, as a puppet in the hands of the United States, Britain, and Israel. And the hashtag is very interesting. It's Camp Buka, which is the US detention center in Iraq, where Baghdadi was held until 2009 when he was handed over to the Iraqi officials. So that is the lens through which the Iranian officials see Daesh. Now, you can say that this is paranoia, this is conspiracy theory, which is something that we are very much used to in that part of the world. Often in private discussions with Iranian officials, they admit that there are other roots and causes to the Daesh phenomenon. They admit that Maliki in Iraq had a disastrous record in governance, failed at an inclusive government, definitely. They often even admit that Assad's use of brute force was just horrible. But that doesn't take away, in the words of Henry Kissinger, the fact that if you're a paranoid, you still have enemies. And they when they look around, they see themselves surrounded by hostile forces. They see themselves encircled by the United States. And again, there's a trend there, right? During the Iran-Iraq war, the sense of solitude that Iran experienced, strategic solitude that the entire West, regional countries were supporting Saddam. The United States turned the other way when Saddam used chemical weapons. Saudi Arabia was funding the Iraqi army, etc., etc. So there is a trend that they see, and this is just the latest stage. When they look off their shores in the Persian Gulf, they see this huge U.S. armada, 40,000 troops in the region, and basically they're afraid of being surrounded and encircled. Now, another fear that the Iranians have is the fear of mission creep. What I mean by that is that again, if you see Daesh as a product of outside actors, you also think that it's a pretext for something else. And the pretext that they consider in this case is for the United States to return to Iraq. They think that the U.S. Was desperate to get out in 2007, 8, 9, but now wants to get back in, and Daesh has provided the pretext, as well as in Syria. They think that the Sunni powers in the region wanted the U.S. To attack Syria. They failed last year, but now this time with the phenomenon of Daesh, not only they've got the U.S. To go in Syria, but they have also engaged in military confrontation directly. I mean, it was impossible for the Iranians to imagine 6 months ago the Saudi Arabia bombing Syria. And they think this is a slippery slope and quite dangerous. Again, if you look at the Supreme Leader's statements, I remember he used to say about the nuclear issue that each time we get close to resolving it, a ghost comes out of nowhere and spoils the prospects of getting a deal. And now he feels the same thing happens in Syria, probably, that every time that the tide turns towards the Assad regime, something happens. So either the chemical weapons issue last year, or it's Daesh this year. Now, what are they doing about this fear? I would say in general, their policy is mostly to downplay the sectarian aspect of this conflict. This is mostly in rhetoric, though. In rhetoric in the Iranian newspapers, in the messaging that they put out there, they constantly say, this is not about Sunni Shia, this is about Western designs, this is about Israeli designs. Ayatollah Khamenei again says that Daesh kills probably as many Sunnis as it kills Shias. The second imperative, as I mentioned, is honor. And honor is a very important element to understand, especially in the Iranian psyche mentality, which is not unlike many other ancient nations. It's a Middle Kingdom thinking. They think of themselves as the indispensable nation in the region that, given its cultural and historic relations with other countries, needs to have a significant role. And it has this role. Lakhdar Rahimi, the former UN and Arab League envoy, said last month that Iran has more influence in Baghdad than the United States and has more influence in Damascus than Russia. And so in that sense, it's totally incomprehensible to the Iranians that they get excluded from the international fora where these issues are discussed, given Paris conference about Iraq or the Geneva conference about Syria. And this sense of frustration pushes the Iranians to actually overemphasize about their importance and their role. You see pictures of Iranian Quds Force commander, General Soleimani, being posted in the international media. Even these days there are selfies of him. with Peshmerga and with other forces in Iraq. They boast about their victories, saving Erbil, breaking the siege of Amerli, liberating Jarf al-Sokhr without any air support from the coalition. And they're really overemphasizing this role in order to say that Iran matters and cannot be excluded from the equation. There's also another aspect that they want to reassure their population that there's no spillover in Iran and they're in charge of the situation. And finally, it has a negotiating tactic use in terms of telling the West and Iran's interlocutors in the P5+1 that if they resolve the nuclear issue, the door opens on cooperation on the regional matters. Now, of course, this strategy of overemphasizing Iran's role in the region, and especially in Iraq and Syria, has the effect of exacerbating what Bernard was talking about, which is the sense of disenfranchisement of the Sunnis, which is one of the roots of the current crisis. Now, the third motive is interest, and the primary interest, I think, is, like many other states, is self-preservation and security. That's why you see Iran is trying to have a buffer zone that separates Daesh-controlled territory from the Iranian borders, be it through the Kurds in the north or to the Shia militias in the south. But Iran also wants Iraq to stay as a unitary country. And again, there are security motivations behind it. It doesn't want a fragmented Iraq to provide platforms for Iran's adversaries in the region to be able to basically buy a border on Iran and bring the conflict closer to its borders. Now, let me end with a quick note about what what's the connection with the nuclear agreement that Mina mentioned. Now, we're almost 10 days away from the deadline, and it's still a very iffy proposition. But I often hear in the media a black and white image of what deal or no deal, failure or success mean for the regional dynamics. Most people treat it as a gateway issue, so that if it's resolved, if there is a deal, all of a sudden Iran and the United States, Iran and the West in general can cooperate on regional matters. I think not necessarily. That's not guaranteed. There have been if you look at the history of Iran's relations with the West, is replete with missed opportunities. We have had a lot of similar experiences in the past. Take the experience of Afghanistan in 2001, when Iran and the US had an unprecedented cooperation in toppling the Taliban and installing a new government in Afghanistan. And just 1 month after that, Israel accused Iran of sending arms to Palestinian militants. And the Bush administration at the time labeled Iran as an axis of evil, member of the axis of evil, and the door was shut on any further improvement in the relations. I think in the event of a similar reversal, we might end up in a situation that, in a future that looks very much like the past. In the sense that we'll go back to Iran's relations with the West right before the nuclear crisis, late 1990s, early 2000s, when there was managed hostility between Iran and the United States and relatively good relations between Iran and Europe, with disagreements, of course, but it wasn't as tenuous as it is today. And the same applies to the relations with Saudi Arabia. And my biggest concern is that if the Saudis see a nuclear agreement as something that is empowering Iran and putting Iran in the same camp as the United States in the fight against Daesh, Iran having more financial resources to project power in the region, the Saudis might be compelled to pull put fuel on the fire in the region somewhere, and that would actually exacerbate the chances of resolving some of these issues. And it's extremely difficult because I don't see a way in which the United States can alleviate the Saudi concerns without running into the first dilemma that I talked about, which is squandering the opportunity that a deal creates in terms of Iran's improvement of relations with the US. So on that rather pessimistic note, let me stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Ali, to end on that pessimistic note. But this is not the end of the evening yet, so might have an happy ending after all. But also, this is not an American Hollywood movie, so we don't have to end on a positive note. Just to pick up on some of the, I think, things you said, and after that we go to the Q&A. So please, now we can also already start formulating very sophisticated questions and so. To pick up on that, you said that the nuclear deal, if we have a deal, so we're still waiting for it, the deadline is approaching. If there is a nuclear deal, that is not necessarily a guarantee that relations between Iran and the US, or let's say Iran and the West, will improve in other areas. But do you think that maybe, I mean, the appearance, the search of ISIS as a threat both to Iranian interests, to Western interests, other interests, could be an issue where we can find some converging strategic interest between Iran and the US? Or is everything compartmentalized? It's working.
No, there's definitely a linkage, but the issue is ISIS is not a phenomenon that is limited to Iraq. It's spread between Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, I think there's convergence between Iran and the United States on how to deal with ISIS. But in Syria, there's total divergence. And that's where the problem is. Because if you fight IS in Iraq and push it out to Syria, it will start fighting the Assad regime. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to bomb Daesh in the interest of the Assad regime? And how is that going to be viewed by the other members of the coalition? So it really turns into a dilemma. And that's why I believe if there is to be a solution, there needs to be an inclusive one in which Iran also has a role and some kind of a long-term vision in terms of a modus vivendi that all of these different players with different competing interests could live with. It's very hard, it's idealistic what I say, but at the end of the day, absent of some kind of dialogue between the Iranians and the Saudis, any kind of rapprochement between Iran and the West, even if it happens in the best case of scenarios, even if the deal is reached, it's welcomed in Washington and Tehran, it's perfectly implemented, there's no problem at all. Still, if there is no dialogue between the Iranians and the Saudis, I'm afraid the prospects of better relationship could be spoiled over the issue of Syria.
Bernard, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do actually. I do agree. I think that that the Saudis will look at any deal that the Iranians sign with the Americans as some form of empowerment of Iran in the region, and with the possibility of going, you see, the Saudi rulers are quite old, and they have very long memories. And they remember a time in the 1970s when Iran was America's policeman in the region. They don't want to return back to that period. That's their greatest fear. They want to be America's principal ally and the West's principal ally in the region. And they feel that they deserve that role because they've been very responsible stewards of the oil wealth. After they've never used oil as a weapon after 1973, and they feel that they ought to, and that they feel they're the most important country in the Muslim world. They speak on behalf of the majority of Muslims and so on. So anything that lessens their importance, whether real or symbolic, is regarded as a threat. And the Saudis can act as spoilers, certainly in Syria. Now, the Saudis can't project power. They have a limited capability when it comes to projecting power. They don't use non-state actors. The last time they did in the Afghan jihad, it backfired very badly. So they don't do that. But what they can do is pay a lot of people, spread money to a lot of different actors, and who can act as spoilers. So that would be my fear. Yes. So I mean, I do agree.
But I mean, what are your building blocks for a solution then? I mean, you basically, I mean, both of you, I think, say that if there's some rapprochement between Iran and the US, in the West there's a nuclear deal, then Saudi Arabia will see that as a threat. So how can you solve that, this dilemma, or maybe trilemma?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there are regional dynamics that have nothing to do with America. So the Saudis regard the Iranians as overplaying their hand by becoming the dominant external power in Arab theaters, namely Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and even to some extent amongst the Palestinians through Hamas. So for the Saudis, this Iranian projection of power into what they consider their backyard, the Arab theater, the Arab countries, is unacceptable. It's like a zero-sum calculus for the Saudis. Of course, the Iranians are not going to up and leave and give up on Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas or Iraq or Assad. So I don't see where there's a room for an agreement between these two countries, where one side certainly sees it as take it or leave it negotiation.
Mina, are you as pessimistic as both gentlemen on the chances for a sort of approachment or a deal between both countries?
I am, for very many reasons, some that were mentioned here, but I think also the US and the Obama administration has played a real role in increasing the distrust. So when the Americans were having their secret talks with the Iranians and the Saudis found out through press reports, and yet again to get surprised by the latest Wall Street Journal article that uncovered the letter to Khamenei that actually said it's mainly about the nuclear deal, but because it was leaked, what made the headlines and what everybody read about was that if we could sort out the nuclear deal, I'm paraphrasing, of course, because none of us saw the letter, but what came across is that if we come across a deal on the nuclear issue, perhaps we could work together to fight ISIS. Something that was not told to the Saudis in the very many meetings they have. And so the problem is that had the Obama administration actually been clearer, not necessarily show all their cards to the Saudis, but at least show some, and build that element of trust that we're not selling you out for the Iranians, that, like Ali said, that if we're making a nuclear deal, we'll probably go back to the 1990s, not to the 1970s. They've not put in that legwork. Wendy Sherman, the Assistant Secretary of State, who was, or Undersecretary of State, was meeting with the Iranians without really briefing many of the Arab diplomats in Washington until very late in the game. So they had several rounds of talks before they started to brief them and tell them, look, this is what we're doing, this is what the end game is. So I think how this has been handled by Washington has actually made it even more difficult to trust that a nuclear deal doesn't mean selling out their Arab allies, and namely Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
You know, I sometimes participate in track 2 discussions where there are Iranians and the Saudis. And the level of misunderstanding, the gap in understanding on both sides is just immense.
It's not just a matter of language.
No, it's like they're really from two different planets, I would say. They don't understand the decision-making processes in each other. They don't understand the hopes and fears of each country. I mean, what Bernard mentioned, for example, if you come to Tehran, you would see that the two of the most important highways in Tehran are named after Iraqis. Iraqi Ayatollahs. Currently, we have the head of Iran's parliament, who is an Iraqi, born in Iraq, Mr. Larijani, and the former head of the Assembly of Experts, who's in charge of supervising and electing a supreme leader, was also an Iraqi, Ayatollah Shahruti. Yeah. You know, so the level of intertwined relations between these countries. Or you come to Isfahan, the most beautiful mosque in Iran is named after a Lebanese cleric. You know, so there are a lot of historic ties here, and someone needs to tell the Saudis, the scholars need to tell them that, you know, you need to get a little bit more realistic about this. And I don't think it's impossible. I don't think we should rule it out. Look, actually, we often say that the current administration in Tehran is the best in order to have a rapprochement with the United States. The reality is, I think the same administration is probably the best opportunity to have a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, because, I mean, a lot in diplomacy is about the people, right? President Rouhani was the person who masterminded the best time in the past 3 decades in relations between the two countries, when he sent his personal envoys, along with the permission of President Rafsanjani at the time, to King Abdullah, who was at the time Crown Prince, and they negotiated the first security agreement that has ever been signed between the two countries. The current ambassador in Riyadh presided over the golden era of relations under President Khatami. Our current national security advisor is an Iranian Arab, so he's from the south, he speaks Arabic. You know, so you have a constellation of characters that could be helpful, and they want it. If you look at President Rouhani's first speech, in it he mentions one of my biggest priorities is improving relations with the Saudis, and they have tried repeatedly. Even it seems like the security establishment has reached out to the security establishment in Saudi Arabia, but they haven't received an open hand, partly because of the fears that Bernard was talking about, that they think Iran is on the ascendance, and talking to them would just make them even more bold in continuing with the policies that they see destructive. On the U.S. relations, you know, when you have a secret channel, it is a secret channel. You're not even going to share it with your allies. It's not going to be secret anymore. Especially in Israel, secrets are extremely difficult to maintain. And in that sense, I don't think the Obama administration did the wrong thing. The reason the talks were secret was because of these sensitivities. Otherwise, there would be no need to have them secret. And the result of those secret talks have actually made Israel and Saudi Arabia safer than before. The Geneva Agreement drained the cartoon bomb that Netanyahu held up in the UN General Assembly. It has also made Saudi Arabia safer, because if there were to be a military confrontation between Iran and the United States, Saudis would pay a price for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks very much. Just to bring in one more point before we go to the Q&A, we haven't heard much about the Syrian regime yet, Bashar al-Assad. Mina, I'll ask you this question, but of course the others can also answer. What do you see as the effect of the bombing campaign on ISIS, on the position of Assad in Syria? Do you think he could take advantage of that in strengthening his position, or?
I think it strengthened Bashar al-Assad in several ways. The first is it brought the regime in from the cold in a way on the international stage when the US informed the Syrian regime that it was going to carry out the strikes. So there was a channel for the first time, and they admitted it. Now, of course, the regime said that this was coordination. The Americans said this was a warning. It doesn't matter. There was an interaction. That's one. The second is it weakened the Syrian National Coalition, the opposition forces, and it weakened the Free Syrian Army in some ways, because it made, again, the US, the West, the coalition, the Friends of Syria group look like it cared to target ISIS, but it didn't care to help the Syrian people. So in many ways, that strengthened the regime de facto by saying, well, look, you guys were taken for a ride for 2.5 years. It didn't matter. When the strikes started and there was, flights over Syrian airspace for those strikes, it had been said for so long that we can't drop much needed supplies to Homs that was besieged for 2 years, where people had to start eating leaves and grass to survive. But those same airplanes couldn't at the time, heaven forbid, intercept Syrian airspace, but they could do it to bomb ISIS. So in many ways, it helped the regime discredit the opposition, the moderate, so-called moderate progressive opposition. It helped them to show that the West's strategy in actually supporting the opposition was failed. So it helped the regime also prove that its narrative was beginning to take hold. It's the regime or the terrorists, so choose one or the other. You've had officials saying behind closed doors often, but now it's coming out more and more, that, hey, maybe we should reconsider our position on Assad. And that goes back to the people on the ground. So some people who might have thought of defecting, many of the displaced people, and otherwise think, oh my God, it's a matter of time before maybe we have a Gaddafi moment where he was branded a terrorist and so forth. And then one day we saw Tony Blair sitting in a tent shaking his hand, as did Condoleezza Rice.
And do you think Assad will end the same way as Gaddafi did? Or?
I wouldn't wish that on anyone. I think that's not the way we should try to see justice being done.
A different type of Gaddafi
yes.
moment. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. We go now to the audience because I see hands going up already, and that's great. But let me please explain a few rules to you. One rule is you can, if you get the mic, and I'm afraid this is not a democratic way, I will just decide who gets the mic, but we sort of go through the audience a little bit. Please state your name and affiliation. And last time everyone said, I have no affiliation. By affiliation, I just mean your job or organization or so. Give us a little bit, you know, of what's your background, just one sentence. No statements, short questions only. So we start there. I think the gentleman over there was one of the first, and keep an eye on. Yeah.
Thank you, Ernesto. And first of all, well, my name is Peter van Leeuwen. I'm an ex-employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, very recently actually. And thank you for bringing us this, this excellent panel. Going back to the dawn of the Middle East, balance of power with a question mark, which I think it has not been responded to concretely yet. Taking into consideration the fact that, well, Dr. Haykel, Professor Haykel, as he said, there is actually not a military solution to this, to what's happening there at the moment in the Middle East. It is a profound movement which is based upon grievances and upon also other, and of course religion and grievances, taking into consideration that it gets more and more support from different parts in the world even. Where will this lead us to, and how to solve this? Is one question. Second?
Okay.
Can a very, very brief...
get one question only, yeah? 3 words.
3 words. Should the Western Alliance actually have been involved again in this development in the Middle East, since we were involved already since 1916?
Okay, thanks very much. We saw a gentleman over here, going all over the place, with the red sweater and the nice jacket.
Thank you, sir. My name is Walid. I'm from Palestine Link. I'm looking for this issue from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I believe the Daesh is a syndrome of the injustice along the destabilization of the Middle East since the Sykes-Picot plan, which result in a Jewish state, which accepted by all of the nations now. And I would like to ask Mina about the keeping the borders. What is bad on making borders on basic nations? If you look to you and to me and Arabs, there is Kurds, there is Persians, there is Turkeys. Why do we need to live in states, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine? Why cannot we live in a state based on nations, Arabs, Kurds, Turkish? Okay. And if it's possible to have a Jewish state or Jewish caliph, why the Islamics, they also
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I think your question is clear. At least I hope it's to Mina. I'm just a simple person. We go here to a lady in front. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Zainab Sabari, Iraqi-born Dutch citizen. Actually, I'm quite wondering, Professor Haykel, where do you think ISIS is getting her support from? Her weaponry, her financial support? Because I think most people would think Saudi Arabia, but if it's Salafism or ISIS is against the Wahhabi regime, where's all the money coming from?
Okay, where does ISIS get its support? I think that's a question many of us have. The gentleman at the back who's been, or is it a lady? Sorry, I don't want to insult anyone. I can't speak different. A lady.
I'm Alida van der Veen. I look at it also from the viewpoint of European history. Is our focus too narrow if we look at ISIS as a sect with a specific ideology of Islamism and forming a caliphate? And is it actually only a cover-up or a tip of the iceberg of a much deeper movement? Warring groups, shifting alliances of people who are not from the government circles but who take the ground and whose ideas may be rooted in ideologies that were important for the last half a century in the region. And I refer to pan-Arabism, but most foremost to Great Syria, the ideology of the Syrian social nationalist movement. And they had a secular ideology, but that was,
yeah, this is not a platform for political speeches, but I got your question, but you gave the answer yourself to it. So, but anyway, maybe they will respond to it. So please, short questions, and you can ask open questions, whatever. If you want to give the answer yourself, then I don't consider that a question. I go for the last one in this round. The gentleman over there, yeah, he's been very modest, and I don't want to overlook him. Here. Over here. So just a short question, please. Can you stand up, please?
My name is Hani Auf. I'm coming from Egypt. The question is, Dr. Haykel, you just said in between that Caliphate just have a kind of, for instance, they have become the family from Muhammad of Quraysh, but I never read that, I never saw it, and I never heard it before. Can you please explain how Caliphate actually is standing up here for that idea?
Okay, explain the Caliphate. How much time do we have here? Maybe you can recommend a few books on that. Okay, we go now to the panel, and we had the first question, I think that was to Bernard, Haykel. Yeah, the second question was also by Peter van Leeuwen, who's our former ambassador in Baghdad and in other places. Should the West get involved in the Middle East at all, and where will this lead, was the first question. And of course, a bit more sophisticated it was, but you understood it, Bernard.
Okay. Look, I'm going to give you an answer. It's going to sound extremely harsh and heartless, but it is based on a kind of realist understanding of the situation. If all the peoples of the Middle East join ISIS and kill each other, as long as they don't approach the oil wells, it's irrelevant to us. It doesn't affect us. Okay? There are certain core interests that the West has in this region. Here I speak, actually, let me just speak as an American rather than as a Westerner. As an American, we have certain core interests in the region. The core interests have to do with the free flow of, the lanes, the shipping lanes, the oil. Perhaps some people care a lot about Israel. As long as ISIS doesn't affect any of these things, frankly, I think there's very little we can do. And the record of Western involvement, and in particular American involvement, is so incompetent and it's so destructive, not only in the region, but the United States has spent over $2 trillion, perhaps even up to $3 trillion, and we have 6,000 or more troops killed, we have 50,000 injured because of the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Our record is disastrous. So the last thing I think the Americans can do is to get more involved in a region that is so complex and where the issues are not just about 1916. Many of the issues that ISIS raise have to do with much earlier Islamic history as well. And so my view is we define what our interests are. As long as ISIS doesn't approach these interests, we do not get involved. And as I told you, I think oil is one of them, for certain. And the shipping lanes is another. The rest it's too bad, you know. The people of this region have to sort out their own problems. Can I answer the support for ISIS?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was for you too.
Right. So the support for ISIS is, it's not entirely clear. I mean, the general rumor is that there are private individuals in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states that are providing money to this movement. I'm not entirely convinced of this, and in any case, there's no proof of it. What we do know is that before the takeover of Mosul, for actually a couple of years, ISIS was shaking down. That is, it was acting like a mafia in Mosul and was taxing every business. And Mosul was delivering about $6 million a month to ISIS. They also controlled the oil fields of eastern Syria for a while. They tax the people where they are based. So there are sources of support that are independent of the Gulf that allow for this movement to exist, and their supplies of weaponry is largely weapons that they've captured from the Syrian army or they've captured from the Iraqi army. So there's no shortage of weaponry in that part of the world.
Okay. Yeah. Mina, you had a couple of questions. One was, what is bad about making borders, and was about nation states from the gentleman over there. And you could also take up the question, which was basically sort of an answer, or rhetorical, I think, whether our focus is not too narrow. I think only on the military part, cover up, and there's some other, trench underneath. No, you don't have to repeat it. Thank you very much. Okay. Here we go.
Okay. Walid? Yes. So your question about the theory of having a nation state for Arabs or a nation state for Turkmen or otherwise, in theory can be discussed. But in reality, if we speak specifically about ISIS here, they're doing it not only by the gun, but by every single violent method possible. So it's not this idea of this vision of having a country together, let's go out there, let's convince people, rally them together. The people living under these ISIS militants are suffering hugely. So in no way would I want to say, and I have a strong Arab sentiment, that this is what I would hope an Arab nation looks like. So that's for one. Two, I mean, clearly these people don't believe in Arabism or even to a certain extent Islam in my point of view, because many of what they're doing would not be permitted by Islam. But even if they're going for an Islamic state, then it's not the pan-Arab dream, so forth. Now, why do we need states? Because that's how the world is functioning now. If we wanted to talk about a utopian era, we don't actually need states and we can congregate together along those that we actually feel that we're close to, then again, that we can discuss in theory, but nation states are as it stands, and I believe that on the ground, if we tried to start reorganizing the map of the region, most families will be torn apart in countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and beyond. And that is a reality. I mean, we've seen the sectarian violence in Iraq over the last 8 or 9 years or so really did tear apart families where people were struggling to live in one area because either the mother or the father is going to be targeted because they're from different sects. So it can't work. Do we need borders? Do we need states? I think we do. I believe in the nation state. Now you refer, of course, to the Jewish state, and that's why many people were discouraged when the negotiations or the talks were restarting between the Palestinians and the Israelis under the auspices of the Americans, that there was the possibility that the Americans agree with this idea that we accept Israel as a Jewish state. Because then it starts people saying, well, okay, then let's have a state for the Druze, and let's have a state for Alawis, and so forth. Because we want to believe in our identities as citizens of our countries, there are many people who find the idea of a Jewish state problematic, because what happens to the non-Jews living in Israel, and then what does that mean for the rest of the region? And I think that's a very important question, and it's very problematic for the region. The second part, I'll be really frank, I really didn't understand much of the point that was posed.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks very much. Yeah, I think we get it, sort of.
I think there are...
go ahead, Mina.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I think the point I was trying to make in my earlier remarks, and maybe I wasn't clear enough, was that we're not really seeing in the region many movements that are based on political aspirations. And many of the riots and the protests we saw were against the current situation, but very few people were actually providing alternatives other than, sadly, ISIS and a few of the other radical groups. And this is a very general term, then you had political parties, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, whether you had the political parties in Tunisia, that actually were proposing political solutions and political programs, and that's what we really need in the region, whether we agree with them or not. But there isn't a political platform with ISIS. That's the whole point, that it is very much a reign of terror.
There's no real alternative that's there. And we had a final question in this round on the caliphate. Now, maybe something unorthodox. Ali, what would be the what would be the three keywords for you to describe the caliphate?
The caliphate? I mean, it's a concept that has changed over time. I don't think the Ottomans were Quraysh, were they? So
they claimed the caliphate, but people raised the question about their descent. I mean, their genealogy, and most people didn't accept their claim. By the way, if you want to find how the caliphate is described, and you read Arabic, presumably, you go to any Islamic legal text, you go towards the end, there's something called the chapter of biographies, or Kitab al-Siyar, which describes the biography of what a caliph should look like. And there you have conditions for the caliph called Shurut al-Imama in Arabic. And one of the conditions of the Imama, that is the supreme leadership of the Muslim community, is descent from Quraysh, is descent from the tribe of the Prophet. Of course, the Shi'is don't say it's the tribe of the Prophet, they say it's a specific lineage from Ali, his cousin and son-in-law. But it's a well-established Islamic doctrine, there's absolutely no controversy about it, and ISIS is tapping into that. In fact, what's interesting about ISIS is that it's tapping into both the Shi'i and the Sunni doctrine of the caliphate, because the caliph of ISIS is not only from Quraysh, he's also a descendant of Ali and Hussein. And that's why, and he claims, and that's why, well, I mean, everyone claims, right? So,
okay, thanks very much. And if you really want to know more of the details, you have to enroll as a student of Professor Haykel, but I'm not sure if he will allow you. I mean, it's very tough, you know, it's a very high level. We continue. Now, the gentleman already had a chance. We go to the next round. The lady here first. Could you stand up, please?
Yeah, Tagreed Al-Khudari, editor at Fanac.com, Chronicle on the Middle East and North Africa. My question, to Mina and to the others, of course. ISIS, Daesh, has successfully employed the new media. And with the new media, you can reach your groups, whether you are in this country or that country, because they are popular to a certain group in different countries. To what extent borders matter? Is it the main, because you mentioned that the borders is kind of the main, factor to get rid of them. So does it matter when you have the new media?
Thanks very much. So follow-up question to the first one. And then I see I see a hand. I don't know who's connected to that hand. Yeah, it's you.
Thank you very much. My name is Maral Kaye. I work at VU University. I have a bit of a simple question. I'm very much interested to hear from all three of you, from your different backgrounds, what you think of how the media is portraying. For instance, there was this Afghani man found, and he was explaining how he was recruited by Iranians. I'm just curious to hear how you, from your different backgrounds, read the media, and if it shocked you, and if it didn't shock you, how you looked at it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And then there in the back, close to the pillar. Yeah. And is there anyone here already who's I overlooked? No. Okay.
Hi, my name is Ivan Zayfert. I study at Amsterdam University College. And my question, or what bothers me, is in absolute numbers, why many young people from Western countries have joined the Islamic State. And my question is, what do you think motivates them to go, and what can you do about it?
Actually, now I know. You didn't come to the last lecture. No, please, you can give the mic back. You didn't come to the last lecture on the 25th of September because Shiraz Meyer explained it in detail. You can watch it on YouTube. Henriette van Lynden lectures. Explains it in all details. Anyway, they will try to answer the question anyway. Lady over here. And those who are sitting upstairs and would like to ask a question, you have to come down for that. But I promise you, when you come down, you will get the mic.
My name is Doreen van Noorn. I'm a colleague of Ernesto for Ministry. I have a question to Mr. Bernard Haykel, because you gave us a very realistic scenario. It's a little bit of Pontius Pilatus scenario, like the United States has to wash its hands in innocence and let the region sort out its own problems. But what about the doctrine of responsibility to protect? And I think that Samantha Power, who is in the administration, is a very strong advocate of that.
Okay, thanks very much. Go for a last one in this round. The lady over here.
Hi, my name is Brigitte Ellis. I also study at the Amsterdam University College.
Lots of students here. Great, welcome.
And this is kind of a follow-up question to you because Professor Haykel gave a very realistic example, and I kind of consider that if they do create, that region does gain a lot of dominance, could this not become a security threat to the United States? Because as we've seen, there has been a lot of youth going to these specific regions. So that's also the United States being influenced by this region. And also the oil, like their financing. So could that not be affected also?
Thanks very much. You put in many different aspects in that question, but that's okay. Then we go back to the panel. There was a question, a follow-up question to Mina on ISIS new media and to what extent do borders matter?
I don't think borders matter to the ISIS recruits, but I think they should matter in terms of what we're trying to preserve as nation states, and I think that follows on about the idea of citizenship and what are your rights, but also responsibilities as a citizen. So if you're going to pick up and go fight somewhere else, what are you fighting for? What does that mean for your own home country? So it's very difficult to unpack it all in a short answer. But I think you're right about new media crossing boundaries for everyone, not just for ISIS recruits, for those that are also against. In the UK, there was a famous campaign called Not In My Name for Muslims who took to social media and were saying that they were against ISIS and that doesn't represent British Muslims. And it became very popular across borders. It didn't matter. Many other Muslims felt that it represented them. There were others in Europe and the US that also joined it. So you're right. I mean, it's a great tool, and I think new media, social media is more positive than negative, and quite often we focus on the negativity of the platform it's given for ISIS to recruit or spread their message, but I think it's also given a voice to others. So I agree with you that borders don't matter to them, but I believe that they should matter to us in the region, because that's the way we can actually protect our countries, unless there is a sort of EU type of union that we can aspire to in the future. And some in Europe would say, maybe not, you're probably better off without it, but who knows? I come from the UK.
Any Brits here?
Yeah, exactly. So I, in part, answer your question. But I think also that borders not counting comes in part to the later question about why do young people join ISIS, and why would they feel a sort of affiliation or attachment or passion to go to a foreign land that they'd never been to fight, and feel stronger about being there, and also feel that they can be more effective. And that's unfortunately one of the attractions of the gun, because you can be much more effective than try to be here and lobby and make an impact in a different sort of way.
In some ways, at least. Then we had a question, well, you already alluded to that, I think, how the media is portraying ISIS. About the motives, I was not very kind to that gentleman who asked the question. I said, look at the YouTube video. But maybe one of you could say something about it?
But just about the role of the media and ISIS,
Yeah.
just very briefly, I think one of the problems, with so many problems, but one of the problems about ISIS and trying to understand ISIS and otherwise is that no journalists can actually go there. And in a war zone, you usually get, you know, reporters on the front line, one way or the other. And because of the brutality of ISIS, because of, unfortunately, what's happened to journalists who have tried to cover that part, we're very much left with only what we're being told by ISIS, whether it's social media or otherwise. And that's, again, creating so many blind spots.
There were two sort of security-related questions for Bernard Haykel. One was about responsibility to protect, but maybe because not everyone is extreme expert here, and maybe I don't know anything about it either. Could you say in a few lines what responsibility to protect means? If you are
as
comfortable with that, and it was about a security threat to the U.S. lady over there.
Yeah. You know, I also want to talk briefly about the absolute number, the numbers that are going there. So I'll sort of bunch it up in my answer, all these questions, and try to answer them all together. So as far as I understand, the responsibility to protect is a doctrine that developed not too long ago, and basically it emerges from scenarios like those in Rwanda, where you have a genocide, and that there's a responsibility to prevent kind of crimes against humanity when they are about to happen. Of course, this has been an incredibly beneficial doctrine for the careers of certain individuals like Samantha Power and others who have risen up through the ranks by invoking it conveniently and often not actually practicing it. It was last invoked properly in recent times when Muammar al-Gaddafi, who's the late leader of Libya, actually threatened to genocidally kill everyone in Benghazi. And when that happened, then the French, with Bernard-Henri Lévy and a number of others, Europeans, and then the Americans were brought in leading from behind, to use the famous phrase of Obama at the time, and started a bombing campaign in Libya, which ultimately helped topple the regime of Muammar al-Gaddafi. But of course, the Libyan case is a very instructive case about the use of this doctrine. So so you topple this guy, and what comes next is probably worse than the way he was ruling the country in the first place. And I think this responsibility to protect doctrine has to always ask the question, okay, intervention to stop something is good, but you also have to make sure that what comes next is not worse than what was there already in the first place. And that's why I think Obama, one of the reasons, he didn't get involved in the war, in hitting Assad when President Assad of Syria used chemical weapons against his own people, even though he had declared this to be a red line that once crossed would, you know, lead to instant retaliation by the United States.
Do you think responsibility to protect after the Libya case, where some allege, I think Russia does that the responsibility to protect was sort of changed into regime change? Do you think the concept is still viable? Can it still be used now?
Well, I mean, certainly the Russians and the Chinese don't want to use won't allow any Security Council resolution that would even permit for the possibility of intervention that may lead to regime change. So how do you implement it as a practical matter is, I think, also an important question, as is the question what happens next once you've toppled a regime that may be committing or may be threatening to commit genocide. Now, in terms of the security threat, look, I told you I was a realist. I think that what Russia is doing in the Ukraine is much more worrying to the West than anything that any Muslim or any Arab can do, short of taking over the oil fields and taking control of the oil fields. In Russia, we have an industrial country with nuclear weapons that can destroy the West. There is nothing that the Arabs have that compares in terms of actual threat to our survival. Okay, and yet we're obsessed with the 1 or 2,000 or 300 or 400, however many Western Muslims are ending up going there, who may come back and blow themselves up in 5 metro stations, God forbid. But so what? It's not a fundamental threat to the West. Terrorism does not bring down our civilization. Nuclear weapons brings down our civilization. fighting a big war against an industrial power like Russia could be a threat to our civilization. Not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, not suicide bombers.
I'm sure that Ali would like to respond to this. I see you writing, and I see a number of people who would also like to respond, so then we get some debate going on here.
Not really, because
I mean, basically,
agree.
whether this, suicide bombers or whatever form, whether that is, a threat to society or not. And you sort of phrase it more in conventional terms, Russia, Ukraine, and so that could be a real threat to European or Western security. But what is your view on it?
Look, I actually think there's a link between how media covers these issues and how the priorities are set, because these days I think policymakers care much more about the image than the real policy, and they reacting to issues because they don't have a grand strategy, because they don't have a vision. They often come up with a policy, with an announced policy, and then they go back and try to reverse engineer the policy behind it.
And it was all much better in the past, of course.
Well, I mean, in terms of a threat to our civilization, I think global warming is probably a much more serious threat to our planet than a few terrorists. But who cares about global warming, right?
Okay.
So
that's a topic for the next lecture.
Yeah. It's all relative. But what I want to say about the U.S.'s role is, I think the problem that we have currently with the U.S. is that it has gone from one extreme to another, from extreme engagement and involvement in the region to none. And you need to have a set of principles that you would just stick to. So that everybody knows that things are clear, right? Either those are international norms which are eroding, international organizations are eroding, but you need to stick to something. You need to have a principled position on something. If it's the use of weapons of mass destruction, if you draw red lines, there needs to be something that is clear-cut, and we currently don't have that, and there's no one else out there who's willing to pick up the slack, and so that's where the problem lies, I think.
I think that touches, a good string with the Dutch audience, country of international law and international legal institutions. Bernard, you would like to
quick follow-up.
make a
I respectfully, I really love Ali, but I respectfully beg to differ with him. Look, and here I'm going to sound like an ugly American. We have a force projection in the Middle East. We have 2 aircraft carrier battle groups, that's 60 ships, permanently based in the Persian Gulf or in the Indian Ocean. That's enough firepower to destroy any number of Middle Eastern countries if we want to deploy that kind of force. Okay, so the fact that we're not actually engaged in the Middle East is not true. The West and America certainly is engaged with enough power to, as I said, destroy a lot and to secure the oil flow, a steady and reliable flow, which, by the way, is not just coming to the United States. It's also going to China, and it's also going to the Far East, and it's going to Europe. So this is what America pays, chooses to pay, in order to maintain the global economic system that it has inherited from the United Kingdom. We are deployed, but we're not intervening. That's the difference that I would like to make. It's an important distinction.
Okay, so we go to the next round. Of course, there's also more self-sufficiency of the US,
yes.
Not so much dependent anymore. We go to the next and possibly the last round, depends. I see a gentleman over there in the back, and then after that, the gentleman here.
I'm Edgar from Amsterdam University College, student there.
Are all the students from the college sitting here?
Happens.
Good.
What do you think, on a different note, is the role of education in the whole radicalization of the Middle East? And in the very long run, what should the West, or actually any partaker in the world, do about it?
Good question. New angle, new dimension. Over there. Yeah.
Martijn Bredere, Nijrode University. My question is to Professor Haykel. Over the last few weeks, we have seen very interesting developments in the oil price. My question to you relates to that. It's, well, to what extent would you relate those developments to the relationship between the US and the Saudis, as well as the Saudis and the Iranians?
Okay, economic question from Nijrode Institute. Yeah, while we're there, the gentleman over there.
Joost Vermeulen, journalist. I would like to know what is the point of view of the speakers towards the internal revolution, which is, as I see it, currently taking place in Saudi Arabia, with view of the coming change of power with the old family.
Okay, thank you. You're predicting something there. Yeah, there's a gentleman who's standing up and waving your hand. Please.
Karel van Broekhoven, Middle East Working Group of GroenLinks political party. I understand that Israel is not receiving any refugees from Syria and the whole problem area in the Middle East. And everybody seems to find it very normal. It seems to be very logic that no refugees can find a place in Israel, and I wonder why that is.
No refugees where going? To Israel.
Israel, yeah.
Okay. Then we take two more questions. Do I see a hand? Yeah. There, the lady. And no one came down from the balcony. Oh yeah, the gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Elise. I'm a student at Cambridge, and I'd like to ask, this is more for Bernard, maybe you've touched upon this, but what's the role of Salafism or Wahhabism in the increasing radicalization of the Muslim world, and primarily on how something you've also mentioned in the beginning, how it's really rooted in ISIS. ISIS ideology is rooted in the Wahhabi creed.
Okay. You traveled all the way here. Good. From Cambridge.
Hi, I'm Hassan Al-Sabri, also a student at Leiden University.
Can you speak in the mic?
Oh, yeah, sure, sorry. I'm Hassan Al-Sabri, a student at the University of Leiden. We've been talking a lot about the current situation of ISIS in the Middle East. But what are the future prospects of ISIS in the Middle East, and what's the role of Saudi Arabia and the other countries?
Okay, thank you. Then we go to a last one, if there is any. Yeah, gentleman in the center.
I'm Nick, also from Amsterdam University College. There's many of us here tonight. To Professor Haykel, you mentioned a few things that you thought were important for the US as far as ISIS goes and its effects. But I'm wondering, what about Muslims living in the US or elsewhere in the West? Because with ISIS growing in power, I see a growing sort of negative sentiment or fear towards Islam and Muslims living in the Western world. And I think that is only going to increase. So,
but what is the question then?
The question is to you, don't you think that Muslims living in the Western world are also an important effect to consider, or the growing negative sentiment towards Muslims living in the West? Isn't that something to consider as well, in addition to oil and...
Thank you. I think I can guess the answer to that, but maybe I'm wrong. The first question we had was a new dimension, the role of education in radicalization. Mina, would you like to take that?
I guess the short answer is, of course. It's one of the main elements has been the failure of education. On the one hand, educating Muslims about their own religion. Many Muslims learn about their religion either from their parents, and then they look for alternative sources, because you never just listen to your parents if they're the ones who are educating you. So where do you look? Well, now you can look online. And the array of views on any given subject that you can find online, if there's someone who's really charismatic and knows how to catch your attention and can give you and feed you very, very radical thoughts, then that happens. There's also a problem of education in some of the Arabic countries and what is actually being taught in some of the school books. And this is an issue that's been raised time and again. And quite often it's only dealt with on the surface and then dropped. The other issue of education is there is a whole generation of Iraqis and Syrians who are risking not getting any education and what that effect has on also the radicalization of the future generations. And so, yes, this is one of the crux of the problems, and there are countries that are not admitting to the problem that they have in their schools, but they'll pay lip service and they'll change just a few contexts. But it is a huge problem of education, because again, for many of us Muslims who say the problem isn't in Islam, it's the way it's being interpreted and taught, it's because of that education, the way that religion is manipulated.
Thank you. Then there was question to Bernard Haykel on the oil price and also prediction of internal revolution in Saudi Arabia.
Right. So on oil price, you know, the oil business is a very cyclical business. It goes from the idea of scarcity and, you know, so price goes up, and you can see it. I mean, during the 2000s, there was this fear of scarcity, which drove up commodity prices as well as oil. And now we're in a cycle which is being hyped about this overabundance or superabundance of oil, largely because of shale, the production of shale oil in the United States, which I think is, again, an exaggeration, and it's a hype about it. And the fact that Europe is economically not doing very well and consumption is declining here, and the fact that both China and India have not risen in their have not increased their consumption, that combined with the increasing surplus that's coming from the United States is depressing prices. It has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would like to see prices much higher than where it is now, but can do nothing, almost nothing about it, unless it cuts back on its own production, which it's not willing to do in a significant manner, because that would mean using oil as a weapon, which it has never done. So I hope that answers your question. On the issue of education, I would also like to add one thing, which is that, you know, the educational systems in the Middle East are bankrupt and have been bankrupt for many decades. The best people who come out of those systems anyway try to leave, so there's a huge brain drain out of the region, and there's a tremendous emphasis on, especially in the Gulf, on religious studies, which are basically useless in terms of producing employment and for industrial and technological advancement. I mean, compare China to the Middle East, the number of engineers there, the number of engineers in the Middle East, and so on. And you can see that we're talking about two regions that are going in diametrically opposed directions in terms of where the economies of these regions are going. Huge number of unemployed people, and that's leading to that certainly feeds into radicalization. And that gets me to the issue of Salafism, which I can address if you like, or yeah, sure. Should I? Just also before Salafism, I just wanted to talk very briefly about the change of power in Saudi Arabia. You know, people have been predicting for 7 decades or 8 decades that the Saudi royal family is about to be toppled. And they have outlasted all their enemies, whether Arab nationalists, socialists, communists, Al-Qaeda. They've remained in power. And they've remained in power for a number of reasons. One of them certainly has to do with the fact that they have this revenue in the form of rent from oil, with which they can buy social peace, and they can buy their population, and they don't tax their population. But they also deploy religion as a way of disciplining their population, and they have a ferociously efficient repressive machine with which to also quell dissent. So the combination of having money, which they have about $800 to $1 trillion worth of reserves at the moment in cash, largely US treasuries. Religion, the ability to control and deploy religion as a force. And finally, repression. Those are pretty powerful tools that can keep you in power for some time. If the oil price, if we were to not use oil anymore and the oil price were to go down very significantly and they were to run out of their reserves, then their days would be numbered. As a regime. And that would be a catastrophe for the country itself, because it would immediately implode and you would see a Syria-like scenario in Arabia.
There was a question about the Muslim community in the United States.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, look, most Muslims don't share Al-Qaeda's ideology or ISIS's ideology, vast majority. In fact, most Salafis don't share ISIS's ideology. And any attack on Muslims or any discrimination against Muslims is simply illegal and unacceptable. It's just as unacceptable as any attack on African Americans in America or Jews or any other community. So for me, it's a problem of policing and law enforcement. and it should be made just simply illegal, which it is. And the American Muslim community in particular, as opposed to the European Muslim community, first of all, is not just one community. It's a very diverse community that includes African Americans, South Asians, Arabs, and others. And it's a prosperous community, by and large. It actually does well in America. We don't have ghettos of Muslims. And so they're fairly well integrated, and they have a role to play, like all Muslims around the world, to fight this ideology and this cancer called ISIS, which is part of which is claiming their religion and claiming their ideology. And they have a role to play, but we also, as citizens of our country, including Muslims, have a role to play to fight discrimination against Muslims or against any other people. I don't see any other answer to this question, and I deplore any form of racism or discrimination on the basis of religion.
Via Twitter, we got a question. We received a question by a certain lady, I think, Snape. Is she in the audience here? No? Right, she is. I'll read out your question. She's there. Good question. Why are we speaking of ISIS instead of IS? Who would like to answer that question? There's different words. Oh, yeah. Why don't you go ahead?
They renamed themselves after they erased the border between Iraq and Syria. They pronounced themselves as a state.
Yeah. So do you call them Islamic State, or do you use another term? I mean, let's say tomorrow they call themselves the Royal Kingdom of the Netherlands or something, you know, then would you follow
Again, that's
that
why I prefer to use the Arabic term rather than playing with English letters. But obviously they're neither a state nor, as Bernard was explaining, truly Islamic. But I really don't think it matters what we call them.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but Mina, yeah.
No, just because there was the gentleman's question about ISIS in the Middle East in the future. And I think it's a relevant question, an important one, because the way that ISIS has developed is that it's a fighting force. So they can't just buckle down on the areas they have and try to develop the state and, have governance and everything. They continue to open new battles because of the way that they've come together. So I think we'll see them try other areas. And there were many people questioning and saying, well, okay, you got Mosul, you consolidated. When you started pushing towards the Kurdish region, that's when they started getting real pushback. And so that's the way they operate. And we've seen just yesterday or today, Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, coming out and saying, that their sights are on Saudi Arabia. And I think this takes it to another level in terms of whether we see that there are attacks in Saudi Arabia, and we saw the incident that happened a couple of weeks ago also in Saudi Arabia that shows that we're going to continue to see more attacks and the way that they operate, and somebody likened them to Mercury. So you try to grab it from here and it pops up there and everything, because again, like Al-Qaeda when they started out, is that they wanted people to affiliate themselves with ISIS and actually start carrying the attacks. So we'll see more and more of this idea of lone wolves who will believe in the ideology of ISIS and try to implement.
Okay, then there was a last question, I think that was not answered yet, about the refugees. Why are there no refugees going to Israel? I understood. Is there anyone who would like to answer that question? No. I see Grace, so let's forget about that one. I mean, the topic is a little bit different, so we're going to, I think, wind up, and therefore I move to the stage here. And I need some assistance. Yes, thank you very much. Now, before we give a warm round of applause to the panelists, to the experts tonight. And before we go to the bar, because some of you might have come for the drinks only, I hope not. I think also for the pearls of wisdom which you have received tonight. I would like to thank, with a warm round of applause, the Rode Hoed here, and Aminata Kone, who's responsible for organizing all of this, who's done all of the work. And also, before we thank the speakers, I would like again to highlight the fact that we have a YouTube channel. Henriette van Lynden lectures, so you can look it up. You can see tonight's lecture in 2 or 3 days and the previous lectures. So please look there. And then based on that, you can also ask follow-up questions on that next time and maybe sort of skip certain questions. Now we're going to thank very much first Mina al-Oraibi for her contributions tonight. Like this. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Professor Bernard Haykel. Nice flowers. Thank you very much. And you have to read his books if you want to know more about Salafism and Wahhabism, etc. And last but not least, Ali Vaez. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming. We'll see you in the new year. You'll get an invitation for the next Henriette van Lynden lecture. The bar is open.